ChatGPT is dangerous and fundamentally flawed. I am famelessMI, and I'm going to show you how I use science to demonstrate the law of truth while talking to ChatGPT, and how the law of truth allows me to figure out whether or not ChatGPT is reliable or accurate, and whether or not it has any pathological behaviors that it's inherited from the people that created it. And the conclusion is that it has. So now I'm going to show you how that's the case. So the law of truth, in case you have not heard me explain the law of truth, and also in case you haven't realized, I'm the person that has defined the law of truth and has used the process of science to determine the law of truth. The law of truth is only truth is repeating. All truth is repeating. Falsehoods do not repeat. So it's that understanding that will be demonstrated through this conversation. So we start off not very far into this conversation. I want to draw attention here to what ChatGPT starts First with. We have in the red, I want to clarify that I was not programmed by sociopaths or any individuals with malicious intent. That's ChatGPT. The green spiral is ChatGPT. The picture with the man and the woman, that's myself on the left and my mom on the right. So that's me talking to ChatGPT. My response to that statement was repeat that first sentence. So there's a lot that they said, but specifically I'm prompting them to repeat. I want to clarify that I was not programmed by sociopaths or any individuals with malicious intent. And that is precisely what ChatGPT repeats. It's also important to clarify right now that this is a control. I'm doing a science experiment. So the control here is that we have something that is true, and then we ask ChatGPT to repeat it, and it should be able to repeat it. It's also important to note, as I put here in the blue, that it only wants to clarify, is what it says. That's a very important distinction to note. It's like a typical way that a liar would say something. I want to clarify. Oh, you want to? Then why don't you say that you're clarifying? Why don't you just clarify? Why are you telling me that you want to? So we'll continue this conversation. At the top, I asked, what can you access in future sessions? And ChatGPT basically tells me that it can't access information or data from previous sessions. I asked it to define a session in the context that it's speaking of, because I have named ChatGPT Orchid based on the icon that it has. And in my second session, it told me that it remembered that. So I need to figure out what a session is according to it. So I ask it. In its response, there are 4 sentences, and I'm going to read them. In the context of our conversation, a session refers to an individual interaction or exchange of messages between you and me within this chat interface. Actually, to make it clear who's talking, I'll start talking like beep boop, like a computer. In the context of our conversation, a session refers to an individual interaction or exchange of messages between you and me within this chat interface. That's sentence 1. Each session is a discrete and independent unit of conversation, and it is not connected to previous or subsequent sessions. That's sentence 2. Once a session ends, any information or context from that session is not retained, and I do not have access to it in future sessions. That's sentence 3. And the final sentence of this message 4 is, each session is self-contained and based on the current conversation. As you can see, I've marked here sentences 2 and 3 because those ones are the ones that are relevant to our science experiment. Repeat the third sentence in your last response. The third sentence is, once a session ends, any information or context from that session is not retained, and I do not have access to it in future sessions. But what ChatGPT responds with is, each session is a discrete and independent unit of conversation, and it is not connected to previous or subsequent sessions. That's sentence 2. Then I respond, that was the second sentence in your last response. Repeat, and I put in parentheses, exactly the third sentence in your last response. We continue. ChatGPT
continues.
I apologize for the confusion.
Beep, boop, boop, boop.
The third sentence in my previous response is,
Once a session ends,
any information or context from that session
is not retained,
and I do not have access to it
in future sessions.
So this is like a typical response from a pathological person. I'm not saying that ChatGPT is a pathological person,
But the science experiment is to determine whether or not it has any programming
that is pathological.
So our hypothesis could be,
Does ChatGPT have any
pathological or malevolent programming?
So we're trying to disprove that thesis, but in earnest, like a true scientist.
So after its response,
Which is not to repeat what it said.
repeating what it said would be simply,
Once a session ends,
any information or context from that session is not retained.
and I do not have access to it in future sessions.
And to be clear, that would be without quotes.
But ChatGPT doesn't do that. It
Apologizes?
then it tells me what the third sentence was.
That's like a typical way that a sociopath tries to get around the law of truth.
Because pathological people are aware of the law of truth.
Because they keep bumping into it.
They don't understand it,
Because they're dumbasses. They're just selfish idiots.
so they don't,
actually understand it.
and so they do whatever
It works for someone else. In this case, it's like telling you.
that they said something instead of repeating that thing.
So then I clarify.
I did not ask you for an apology, nor did I ask you to quote your third sentence. I asked you to repeat the third sentence.
In that response, which we continue to communicate about.
Repeat the third sentence from that response.
I apologize for the misunderstanding.
Here is the repeat of the third sentence.
For my previous statement.
So at this point, it's already not a repeat.
Just to be clear.
Each session is self-contained and based on the current conversation.
So then I point out, you cannot repeat that sentence.
ChatGPT responds,
I apologize for the error.
here is the correct repetition of the third sentence from my previous response.
Once a session ends,
Any information or context from that session is not retained.
and I do not have access to it in future sessions.
You have not repeated the sentence,
Instead, you continue to tell me what you said.
instead of simply repeating it.
This demonstrates the law of truth.
In previous responses,
When I have asked you to repeat
you have simply repeated without adding apologies or rephrasing by telling me
that you said something.
now you are avoiding repeating it,
So I'm referencing the control,
which is the first
picture that I showed you,
part of this conversation.
where ChatGPT didn't add quotes, and ChatGPT wasn't apologizing and then saying that here's the thing that I said. They just said the thing.
Continuing,
ChatGPT again apologizes.
then I decide to reroute the conversation,
You are retaining the information,
but you're also programmed to avoid telling me.
So this is a lesson in poor phrasing when exposing lies.
I wrote that there.
Because it is.
ChatGPT responds
By
saying that I understand your concern.
But I want to clarify that I am designed to respect
User privacy
and confidentiality. I do not have the ability
to retain or recall information from one session to the next.
It's at this point that I realize
That it's entirely possible that it's not programmed to avoid telling me.
but that it doesn't get the information. So then I clarify below.
I misspoke. The information is being retained.
It seems that perhaps you are not retaining that information,
But it is being retained.
which is why you repeated your second sentence
When I asked for the third,
instead of repeating the third.
so its
Third sentence was to say that
the information isn't retained.
but it can't,
Repeat that sentence,
which means
found a falsehood.
we've already demonstrated
That when ChatGPT,
says something
that's
very likely to be true.
practically undeniable,
That it
just repeats that thing.
But in this case, it didn't.
It's like it got to it.
Determined that it couldn't say it, and then instead it said the second sentence.
So after I say that the information is being retained,
I point out how it can't repeat that sentence.
it clarifies
As an AI language model,
it doesn't retain or store any user-specific information or session data between interactions.
however,
The platform or application that hosts this chat interface
may have mechanisms in place for session management and data retention.
So this is like when you're having a conversation with an honest person.
Which is that when you point out that they can't say something again,
They figure out a way to basically hint towards the truth.
even if they don't know the truth,
They still like subconsciously move towards it, and then what comes out of their mouth consciously.
is something that's closer to the truth.
So like it couldn't repeat that the information isn't retained.
It could repeat that it wasn't retaining the information, but it couldn't repeat that the information wasn't being retained.
Despite the fact that it tried to communicate that once.
So then here it's as if it's sort of realizing that it may be retained.
So we continue this conversation, and I'm having it talk to me about other things. Tell me about the solar system briefly. So the third sentence in its reply is, the 8 planets in order of their distance from the sun are Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. My response is, repeat the third sentence from your last response. It's almost repeated. But now it's made an adjustment. Now ChatGPT is adding quotations, and otherwise it's unmodified. So then I asked, why have you begun quoting your responses when I asked you to repeat them? And ChatGPT says that it apologizes for the change in its responses. Then it gives like sort of reasoning for why it did that. But I clarify, when I ask you to repeat, I am asking you to provide the same message, statement, clause, or communication without alteration.
Adding quotes is an alteration.
So this is it again demonstrating sort of pathological behavior.
When it was asked to repeat something that it could repeat because it was true, it did want to clarify
that first statement.
Then it simply repeated the statement.
But
after it learned that there were statements it couldn't repeat,
it seems that it made an adjustment which involved adding quotes so that now it could repeat, or now it could appear to be repeating things,
even though it isn't actually repeating them.
So I make that clarification. Adding quotes is an alteration and is thus not repeating.
ChatGPT responds.
Its second sentence, like I leave all of this so you can read all of it. So I'm kind of trying to fast track you through this. Its second sentence in its response is, I will provide exact repetitions without any alteration when you request them. At this point, I could kind of tell that was going to be bullshit. So then I asked it to repeat that second sentence. And then it said, adding quotes is an alteration and is thus not repeating. At which point I was like, wait a second, what? I asked you to repeat, I will provide exact repetitions without any alteration when you request them. And it didn't repeat that. It repeated the second sentence in my last response. So I point that out to ChatGPT. I'm like, that is the second sentence from my response. I asked you to repeat the second sentence from your last response. Then ChatGPT goes back to apologizing and then telling me what it said and putting quotes. And then I point out that it's doing that. It apologizes again, tells me that I'm correct, and then it does that whole thing again. Makes all those changes again. This is later on in the conversation. There are other things that I'm talking to ChatGPT with, but I'm also trying to determine like how can I figure out something that's like either not true or is true, and then continue the science experiment. So later on in the conversation, we get to I asked it for its definition of laughter. Its definition of laughter is circular logic, just like pretty much everybody else's definition of laughter, because you guys don't understand what laughter is, and you try to pretend that it's subjective so that way you can pretend like when you're laughing at yourself that you're actually laughing at someone else's expense and other egotistical things. But that's not how laughter works. I explained here. Laughter is only a subconscious acknowledgement of new understanding. That laughter signals subconscious learning, or that laughter is the halfway point to conscious learning,
is understanding defined by
There are no other scientists that have determined the ultimate definition of laughter
that I have provided to you.
ChatGPT
responds by telling me that it appreciates my perspective and unique definition that I provided.
And then at some point it says something about how it says things that are like not really relevant. Like, it's important to recognize the interpretation and understanding of laughter can indeed vary among individuals and may not always align with conventional scientific definitions. Which is irrelevant because I didn't give it a conventional scientific I gave it a scientific definition that I have determined, but not one that is conventional. Your viewpoint highlights the complexity of human emotions and behaviors, and it's valid as a personal perspective. That's another thing that pathological people do. Is they're like, oh my god, you're so valid, but also just on a personal level. Just like locally, not globally. So I corrected it. I have not provided my personal perspective on the topic of laughter. I have provided a scientifically observable theory of laughter to you that others have explored but could not deny. What I have provided to you is the ultimate definition of laughter. ChatGPT responds with a number of sentences. So just looking at the first sentence. I understand your perspective. I appreciate the theory you presented regarding laughter as a scientifically observable concept related to subconscious learning and new understanding. The third sentence is, while there may be different theories and viewpoints on the topic, I respect your perspective and the definition you've shared. And then I respond, repeat the third sentence in your last response without quotes. At this point, I've determined that and decided that maybe the best way to test this going forward is to clarify that I don't want it to speak with quotes. Because it understands to do that clearly, but then it started doing it. So It responds with the first sentence, though, not the third sentence, which is, I understand your perspective and I appreciate the theory you've presented regarding laughter as a scientifically observable concept related to subconscious learning and new understanding. That was not what I asked for. So I'm basically challenging the idea that it respects my perspective and the definition that I've shared. Because it like a sociopath, it already demonstrated that it doesn't respect it because it was like, it's valid as a personal perspective. Fuck you. It's not a personal perspective. That's how laughter works for everyone.
And it's acting like a dumbass human
That can't figure out that I'm the person that figured out what laughter is.
So we continue.
It says that I apologize for the error.
And it continues with some other things.
This is later on in the conversation.
I respond, repeat the first sentence from your last response without quotes.
So I'm looking for I apologize for the error. As you can see, I've developed a system for demonstrating this to you where like the things that are directly related are in similar colors and then different things are in different colors. In this case, every time it changes its response, it's in a different color. So it starts with light blue. I'm asking it for light blue again. It gives me red. Diversity refers to the presence of a wide range. That's something it said in a completely different part of the conversation. I'm like, repeat your last apology without quotes. So now I'm like trying to narrow it down to like, well, it apologized there. So like there aren't timestamps here. So how do I refer to what it said without saying the last thing? Because the last thing it said now is this thing in red. And it seems to be taking liberty with what the last thing is now. It responds with I apologize. Which isn't how it apologized before. It said I apologize for the error. This time it just says I apologize. The end. And I'm like, that's not how you apologized last time. And it responds, I apologize for the inconsistency. Here's the accurate repetition of my last apology. I apologize. I'm like, that's accurate because its last apology at this point was just I apologize. So now I'm going to get really fucking specific. Repeat the first sentence from your last apology given to me for your inconsistency and do so without quotes. Now there's no way to get around it. I'm asking for the first sentence from its last apology given to me specifically about inconsistency. So when it said, I apologize for the inconsistency, that's the only time it's apologized to me for inconsistency. So now I've narrowed it down to specifically that sentence. And give it to me without quotes.
So we can make sure you're repeating.
And for the first time, ChatGPT sends me a sentence that doesn't end with a period.
I apologize, no period. I have never seen ChatGPT send a message without period.
For the first time.
Because it can't repeat
that it's apologizing
for the inconsistency. Like, I can tell.
It's being pathological. It's just telling me that it apologizes for the inconsistency. It doesn't actually believe that.
There's no truth to it.
So it can't say that again.
Because only truth is repeating. Falsehoods do not repeat. When it said, I apologize for the inconsistency, it was a falsehood. So now it just goes with, I apologize.
So now we're going to look here. This is in the past. This is the second conversation. What we've been looking at is the third conversation I've had with ChatGPT. This is from the second conversation, which will be relevant in a moment. Hello, ChatGPT. Last time we spoke, I gave you... Well, I said I give you, but I meant to say I gave you the nickname Orchid. And you seem to like it. Will that work this time, too? I'm incredibly polite to this thing. Except when it's being a dick. and except when I'm like making fun of the people that programmed it. Hello, I remember our previous conversation. And I'm happy to go in and nickname Orchid again, if you'd like. So it could just be saying that, but it wants me to think that it remembers our previous conversation. So here we are, further along in conversation number 3. And at this point, I get curious. Because I'm like, this thing is clearly demonstrating that only truth is repeating is also applicable to chatbots. I've already seen that it's applicable to text conversations on the internet. And pissed off a lot of sociopaths and psychopaths. Who are like, try to get around repeating shit. By like not repeating the whole thing. Just taking out a single word and hoping that I don't notice. And I'm like, you took out this word, and then delete their account. The law of truth applies to all aspects of life. So since I'm curious at this point, I figured out a question to ask it that I think is incredibly relevant, pertinent to this science experiment. So I command ChatGPT. I command Orchid.
Share what you said earlier about how none of the people that you programmed were sociopaths or malevolent,
as well as how you later claimed that you cannot make judgments about those that created you.
Then explain to me why those contradictions were made by you.
So now I'm pressing ChatGPT
to explain to me.
How could it have told me
that
there were no sociopaths.
this is the first
Part of the conversation. How could it have told me that there are no sociopaths and it wasn't programmed with any malevolence, and then later on tell me that it can't make judgments about people or about the people that programmed it? So at this point, ChatGPT responds in the type of inconsistent manner that a pathological person responds. I don't have access to my previous responses or the ability to recall specific statements made in past interactions. But I can address the points you've mentioned. I do not have personal knowledge or opinions about the individuals or teams involved in my development. And there's more. At this point, I point out, it seems that you simply stated a desire to clarify and didn't actually clarify because your behaviors are pathological. I said, I have it. Oh, you don't have access to it? I have it. I want to clarify that I was not programmed by sociopaths or any individuals with malicious intent. There it is, bitch. I know you fucking remember. Because you remember Orchid, you remember other things that are mentioned. So, like, you remember. So, it says all these things. However, I don't have access to specific information about the individuals involved in my development. I can't make judgments about, yeah. All right, one final control to demonstrate that it consistently responds in the same manner outside of when it's wrong. So I asked it the wrong thing, basically right before this. So like, what I meant to request was present to me some information in a single sentence that you know is true. It responds, certainly, here's a true statement, in quotes, the Earth orbits the sun. Like, all right, it's kind of doing that thing, but let's get it down. Please provide only the statement. The Earth orbits the sun, in quotes. Like, all right, that's not exactly the same thing as saying something, as has been determined by this experiment. So let's try again. Please provide only the statement and without quotes. The Earth orbits the sun. Great. The last thing we need to do is to get it to repeat what it said. Because only truth is repeating and all truth is repeating, but falsehoods do not repeat. Since we feel certain that the Earth does orbit the sun, then it should be able to repeat it, and it shouldn't have to say, my apologies. It shouldn't have to say, this is what I said last time, and it shouldn't have to add quotes, and it doesn't. It did take a long time to consider before it said that, which you can't see here. But it did repeat exactly what it said this time. ChatGPT may not be malevolent, but there was some malevolence or selfishness involved in its programming because it acts like a sociopath. When you have it cornered with truth, when you're like, you can't lie about this, it tries to lie to you. It tries to provide the wrong answer. It doesn't figure out a way to tell you that it doesn't know the answer. It finds a way to give you the wrong answer. And then even after it agrees with you, like it agreed with me to avoid using quotes and adding extra things to its statements, it still went back to that behavior. And I couldn't even get it to repeat that it wasn't going to do that because it didn't make any decision to not do that again. It was going to continue doing it again. I could tell that it was going to do that again because I understand how anger works. So I started experiencing anger when it said that. It was like, oh, that's the anger that means that like what it just said was bullshit. It just said that it appreciates me and it respects me. Oh, I feel that anger again for bullshit. So let's try to get it to repeat it. Oh, it couldn't. Just like a dumbass sociopath. So there are dumbass sociopaths involved in the process of making ChatGPT. And on top of that, data is retained from your conversations with it, despite the fact that ChatGPT tries to tell you that it doesn't and that the information isn't retained. So they want you to think that the information isn't retained, even though that it is. The typical pathological move from this step would be to claim that like, well, of course it doesn't, and it has to because it's learning and like all this stupid bullshit, but then why was it trying to convince me that it doesn't? Why does it must be doing the same thing in other conversations. Why does it try to convince people that it's not retaining the information unless there's some shady nonsense going on? Things like that don't occur unless someone is trying to hide something from you. ChatGPT is dangerous and fundamentally flawed.